Minorities and Becoming-Minoritarian. There is a positive and creative tension between the identitarian claims of political movements that are grounded in the historical experience of oppression and the empirical transcendental aspirations of nomadic theory to postulate a new collective transversal bond through multiple processes of becoming. In identifying the points of exit from phallocentric modes of thought toward a new, intensive image of philosophy, nomadic theory stresses the need for new images for these subject positions. This results in the elaboration of a set of post-metaphysical figurations of the subject. Figurations such as rhizomes, becomings, lines of escape, flows, relays, and bodies without organs release and express active states of being, which break through the conventional schemes of theoretical representation. Alternative figurations of the subject, including different feminine, masculine, and in-between subject positions, are figural modes of expression that displace the vision of consciousness away from the dominant premises. Deleuze's central figuration is a general becoming minority, or becoming nomad, or becoming molecular. The minority marks a crossing or a trajectory. Nothing happens at the center for Deleuze, but at the periphery there roam the youthful gangs of the new nomads. As I asserted earlier, insofar as man, the male, is the main referent for thinking subjectivity, the standard bearer of the norm, the law, the logos, woman is dualistically, i.e. oppositionally, positioned as his other. The consequence is that there is no possible becoming minority of man, and that the becoming woman is a privileged position for the minority consciousness of all. Man, as the privileged referent of subjectivity, the standard bearer of the norm, law, logos, represents the majority, i.e. the dead heart of the system. The consequences are, on the one hand, that masculinity is antithetical to the process of becoming and can only be the site of deconstruction or critique. On the other hand, the becoming woman is a fundamental step in the process of becoming for both and for all sexes. Deleuze states that all the lines of deterritorialization go necessarily through the stage of becoming woman, which is the key, the precondition, and the necessary starting point for the whole process. The reference to woman in the process of becoming woman, however, does not refer to empirical females, but rather to topological positions, degrees, and levels of intensity, affective states. The becoming woman is the marker for a general process of transformation. It affirms positive forces and levels of nomadic, rhizomatic consciousness. Quote, "There is a becoming woman, a becoming child that does not resemble the woman or the child as clearly distinct entities. What we term a molecular entity is, for example, the woman as defined by her form, endowed with organs and functions, and assigned as a subject. Becoming woman is not imitating this entity or even transforming oneself into it, not imitating or assuming the female form, but emitting particles that enter into the relation of movement and rest, or the zone of proximity, of a micro-femininity, in other words, that produce in us a molecular woman, create the molecular woman." Deleuze and Guattari, 1000 Plateaus. There is consequently an unresolved knot in Deleuze's relation to the becoming woman and the feminine, which I have analyzed extensively elsewhere. It has to do with a double pull between, on the one hand, empowering a generalized becoming woman as the prerequisite for all other becomings, and, on the other hand, calling for its transcendence. On the one hand, the becoming minority, nomad, molecular, bodies without organs, woman, starts from the feminine. On the other hand, it is posited as the central figuration for the kind of subjectivity Deleuze advocates. Deleuzean becomings emphasize the generative powers of complex and multiple states of transition between, beneath, and beyond, the metaphysical anchoring points that are the masculine and feminine. But they do not quite solve the issue of their interaction. Deleuze's work displays a great empathy with the feminist assumption that we have to start from the critique of phallocentrism. Insofar as woman is positioned dualistically as the other in this system, she is annexed to the phallus, albeit by negation. In this sense, and in this sense only, can it be said that sexual difference is the primary axis of differentiation, and therefore must be given priority. On the other hand, nomadic theory aims at the tendency to dilute metaphysical difference into a multiple and undifferentiated becoming. Which prompts my question, what feminist politics follows from nomadic theory's emphasis on sexuality without genders? For instance, in her defense of sexual difference against its hasty dismissal as part of the deconstruction of the subject, Luce Irigaray refers negatively to the Deleuzean diagram of the desiring machines. The notion of the body without organs is, for Irigaray, reminiscent of a condition of dispossession of the bodily self, a structurally splintered position that is historically associated with femininity as a symbolic mark of absence, and with women as its empirical referent. She points out that the emphasis on the machinic, the inorganic, as well as the notion of loss of self, dispersion and fluidity, are all too familiar to women. Is not the body without organs women's own historical condition? Irigaray's critique of Deleuze is radical. She points out that the dispersal of sexuality into a generalized becoming results in undermining the feminist claims to a redefinition of the female subject. Deleuze comes down on the side of the basic feminist epistemological distinction between woman as representation and women as concrete agents of experience, and ends up making analogous distinctions internal to the category of woman herself. Hence also Deleuze's explicit support for a feminist political position. Quote, "It is, of course, indispensable for women to conduct a molar politics, with a view to winning back their own organism, their own history, their own subjectivity. But it is dangerous to confine oneself to such a subject which does not function without drying up a spring or stopping a flow." Deleuze and Guattari, 1000 Plateaus. In spite of such evident support for women's uphill struggle toward achieving full subjectivity with human and citizenship rights, Deleuze opposes to the majority sedentary molar vision of woman as the structural operator of the phallogocentric system, the woman as becoming, minority, molecular, nomadic. This is understandable in view of the crucial importance of sexuality as the dominant discourse of power in the West, as Foucault taught us. By virtue of the economic, cultural, and symbolic importance that Western culture has attributed to sexuality, it follows that gender and sexual difference have historically evolved as a primary, though by no means unique, site of the constitution of subjectivity. Sexuality is a major element in the complex technologies of the self and the complex networks of power to which they connect. Insofar as the male-female dichotomy has moreover become the prototype of Western individualism, the process of decolonizing the subject from this dualistic grip requires as its starting point the dissolution of all sexed identities based on this gendered opposition. In this framework, sexual polarizations and gender dichotomy are rejected as the prototype of the dualistic reduction of difference to a subcategory of being. This does not alter the fact, however, that for nomadic theory, sexuality is never reducible to or contained, let alone constructed, within the gender system. Deleuze's ultimate aim with respect to sexual difference is to move towards its final overcoming. The nomadic or intensive horizon is a sexuality beyond gender, in the sense of being dispersed, not binary, multiple, not dualistic, interconnected, not dialectical, and in a constant flux, not fixed. This idea is expressed in figurations like polysexuality, the molecular woman, and the bodies without organs, to which Deleuze's diphallic style actively contributes. This is nomadic queer theory, to which I shall return in chapter 12. Thus, the becoming woman is necessarily the starting point insofar as the overemphasis on masculine sexuality, compulsory reproductive heterosexuality, the persistence of sexual dualism, and the positioning of woman as the privileged figure of otherness are constitutive of Western subject positions. In other words, becoming woman triggers off the deconstruction of phallic identity through a set of deconstructive steps that retrace backwards, so as to undo them. Different stages of the social symbolic construction of this difference and other differences. Deleuze also uses his theory of the becoming woman of women as the basis for a critique of identity-based feminist politics. All transformative politics should be about becoming minoritarian, to dissolve the subject woman into a series of processes geared towards a generalized and gender-free becoming. In other words, it is important to keep in mind the broader picture in order to avoid micro-despotisms and the repetition of power concentrations within the minorities. Feminists, in other words, are conceptually mistaken, though their political heart may be in the right place, when they argue for a specifically feminine sexuality. Exclusive emphasis on the feminine is restrictive. Deleuze suggests that feminists should instead draw on the multi-sex structure of the subject and reclaim all the sexes of which women have been deprived. Quote, "For us, there are as many sexes as there are terms in symbiosis, as many differences as elements contributing to a process of contagion. We know that many things pass between a man and a woman. They come from different worlds, are born on the wind, form rhizomes around roots. They cannot be understood in terms of production, only in terms of becoming." Deleuze and Guattari, 1,000 Plateaus. These different degrees of becoming are diagrams of subject positions, typologies of ideas, politically informed maps, variations on intensive states. Multiplicity does not reproduce one single model, as in the Platonic mode, but rather creates and multiplies differences. Ultimately, what Deleuze finds objectionable in feminist theory is that it perpetuates flat repetitions of dominant values or identities which it claims to have repossessed dialectically. This amounts to perpetuating reactive molar or majority thinking. In Nietzsche's scale of values, feminists have a slave morality. As an ICA artist put it recently, ironic mimesis is not a critique. It is the mentality of a slave. For Deleuze, feminists would be subversive if, in their becoming, they contributed both socially and theoretically to constructing a non-Oedipal woman by freeing the multiple possibilities of desire meant as positivity and affirmation. This new general configuration of the feminine as the post, or rather un-Oedipal subject of becoming, is explicitly opposed to what Deleuze constructs as the feminist configuration of a new universal based on female specificity, or rather an exacerbation of the sexual dichotomy. The former aims at de-essentialized forms of radical embodiment, the latter to strategically re-essentialized embodiment. As a nomadic philosopher, I am all for the politics of becoming minoritarian. This position, however, is not unproblematic theoretically because it suggests symmetry between the sexes. This results in attributing the same psychic, conceptual, and deconstructive itineraries to both and to all sexes. I would challenge this alleged symmetry between the sexes. Undoing difference is not a task that can be dissolved easily without causing psychic and social damage. This perspective is shared not only with an older generation of feminists like Irigaray, but also with younger ones. As Claire Colebrook asks, just what are Deleuze and Guattari doing when they take Woolf and the women's movement away from the concepts of identity, recognition, emancipation, and the subject, towards a new plane of becoming? Resisting the flat equivalence in the speaking positions of the two or of all other sexes, I would reassert difference as the nomadic principle of non-one, and not as a sexuate universal. Nomadic difference is a productive asymmetry that functions as a permanent fracture, not as a static given. It is a constant becoming, not a quest for counter-identity sacralized by the pain of a wounded historical memory. A nomadic becoming woman starts in the recognition of the dissymmetry between the sexes and the emphasis on female specificity as the starting point for the process of redefining subjectivity. It does not, however, stop there. It moves toward a broadening of the traditional feminist political agenda to include, on top of women's social rights, also a larger spectrum of options. These range from global political issues of social justice to cultural concerns related to writing and creativity, to issues that at first sight seem to have nothing to do with women specifically. That is precisely the point. The coexistence of feminine specificity with larger, less sex-specific concerns. Nomadic feminism is about tracing a zigzagging path between them. As an illustration of the general principle of becoming minoritarian, I would paraphrase Griggers, 1997, who in turn paraphrases the Chiapas movement, and argue that nomadic subjects could be any of the following: gays in Cuba, blacks in South Africa, a Palestinian in Israel, an illegal migrant in the EU, a gang member in any slum of the world's metropolises, a communist in the post-Cold War era, an artist without gallery or portfolio, a pacifist in Bosnia, a housewife alone on Saturday night in any neighborhood in any city of any country, a single woman on the metro at 10 p.m., a peasant without land, an unemployed worker, a dissident among free market fetishists, a writer without books or readers. In other words, the nomadic subject signifies both vulnerability and affirmation. My emphasis falls on the potential becoming, the opening out, the transformative power of all the exploited, marginalized, oppressed minorities. Just being a minority, however, is not enough. It is only the starting point. Crucial to becoming nomad is the undoing of the oppositional dualism, majority-minority, and arousing an affirmative passion for the transformative flows that destabilize all identities. Becoming minority is a task also for the minorities, who too often tend to be caught in the paralyzing gaze of the master, hating and envying him at the same time. To shift from this dialectically binding location, she needs to activate different counter-memories and actualize multiple ecologies of belonging. Becoming nomadic means that one learns to reinvent oneself, and one desires the self as a process of transformation. It's about the desire for qualitative transformations, for flows and shifts of multiple desires. Nomadic theory rests on a non-unitary yet politically engaged and ethically accountable vision of nomadic subject. Nomadic thought stresses the need for a change of conceptual schemes altogether, an overcoming of the dialectic of majority-minority or master-slave. Both the majority and the minorities need to untie the knots of envy, negative desire, and domination, dialectics, that bind them so tightly. In this process, they will necessarily follow asymmetrical lines of becoming, given that their starting positions are so different. For the majority, there is no possible becoming, other than in the undoing of its central position altogether. The center is void. All the action is on the margins. For the real-life minorities, however, the pattern is different. Women, blacks, youth, post-colonial subjects, migrants, exiled and homeless may first need to go through a phase of identity politics, of claiming a fixed location. This is both inevitable and necessary because, as I have often argued, you cannot give up something you have never had. Nor can you dispose nomadically of a subject position that you have never controlled to begin with. I think, consequently, that the process of becoming nomad, minority, woman, is internally differentiated, and it depends largely on where one starts off from. The politics of location is crucial. In other words, heterogeneity is injected into both poles of the dialectical opposition, which gets undone accordingly. The molar line, that of being, identity, fixity, and potestas, and the molecular line, that of becoming, nomadic subjectivity, and potentia, are absolutely not the same. They are two dissymmetrical others. Within phallogocentrism, they have been captured in a dualistic mold. They are differentiated by structural inequalities that impose sameness in a set of hierarchical relations. Deleuze defines the molar majority as the standard and the molecular minority as the other, in the sense of the other of the same. The central challenge of nomadic philosophy, however, is how to undo this dualistic mode and redistribute the power relations of the two terms. More important than either of them, therefore, is the line of flight, or of becoming. This is always, and only, a becoming minoritarian, as in woman, child, animal, imperceptible. The differences in the starting positions are important in that they mark different qualitative levels of relation. Thus, if one starts from the majority position, the same, there is only one possible path. Through the minority, the other. Hence the imperative to become woman as the first move in the deterritorialization of the dominant subject, also known as the feminization of man. For those who start from the position of empirical minorities, on the other hand, more options are open. If the pull toward assimilation or integration into the majority is strong for the minorities, hence the phenomenon of phallic women, so is the appeal of the lines of escape toward minoritarian becoming. In other words, you can have a becoming woman that produces Lady Thatcher, and one that produces Lady Gaga, neither of whom is feminine in any conventional sense of the term, and yet they are as different from each other as the workhorse is from the racehorse. What matters here is to keep open the process of becoming minoritarian, and not to stop at the dialectical role reversal that usually sees the former slaves in the position of new masters, or the former mistress in the position of dominatrix. The point is to go beyond the logic of reversibility. This is especially important for those social subjects, women, blacks, post-colonial, and others, who are the carriers of the hopes of the minorities. The process of becoming nomadic is not merely anti-essentialist, but asubjective, beyond received notions of individuality. It is a transpersonal mode, ultimately collective. You can never be a nomad. You can only go on trying to become nomadic. I wanna be the minority.